Those changing sort of spatial centres of investment are coming about by big shifts in the rates of growth in R&D spending. So what I've got here is the average by decade from the 1960s up to 2000 of spending growth. And so here's the high-income countries. So there's a bunch of probably older colleagues in the room. When you join the land grant system or the USDA in the 1960s and 70s, things were pretty good. Budgets were growing in real terms by 8 or 9% per year for a decade or so. And you can see there's been this ratcheting down and down and down. And this is across all of the high-income countries. So it's not just here in the US. In fact, in the US, in real terms, the US has been cutting back in spending since 2002 on public sector food and ag R&D. But the rest of the rich world isn't doing much better either. So we've gone from growth rates of 6, 7, 8% down to growth rates of less than 1% in real terms. The Asia-Pacific region is very different. They have been ramping up their rates of growth in R&D investments, but they've also been amongst the fastest growing agricultural economies in the world as well. So what's driving what is hard to tease out, but there's certainly a concordance between the rates of growth of agricultural output and the rates of growth of R&D spending. They sustained very high 4 to 6% rates of growth for 3 or 4 decades. You do that, that starts to make an impact. And they've actually ramped up their investment levels as best we can measure in the last decade or so. A region of the world where we have lots of problems, and I'm spending a lot of my time now, is in sub-Saharan Africa, where it's a very different story. When we came off the back end of colonialism back in the 60s, we had a lot of foreign aid money going into sub-Saharan Africa, which saw very healthy rates of growth in public sector ag R&D spending, but it didn't last. And we had a bunch of dismal decades where we had a ratcheting down or a cutting back in R&D spending. And there's been a recovery, an encouraging recovery in R&D spending in that part of the world in the last decade. But unfortunately, if you scratch below the surface, it makes you nervous that it's very thin. There's just a few countries that have recovered their rates of growth of spending. There's not an apparent, at least to my mind as I look at the data, widespread sustained growth in R&D spending in sub-Saharan Africa. But you can see those rates of growth are pointing to very fundamental differences in the sustained investment trajectories that have taken place with respect to where in the world you sit. And so consequently, if you look at the top 10 table, big shuffling going in terms of who sits in that top 10 table. So back in the day, back in the early 60s, the US in real terms spent 3 times plus more than China. By my estimates now, China is now spending more than the US on public sector ag R&D. These countries dropped out of the top 10. Some of my colleagues in Australia think things are pretty healthy, but they don't appear in the list anymore. So UK, South Africa, Australia, Argentina have dropped out. And these countries have come in or moved substantially up the ranking. These are India, moved from 8th to 4th place in the ranking. New entrant Brazil, France, Spain, South Korea. So that top 10 table shuffling big time too. So at the broad aggregate level and when you go down to the country level, a big change in the pattern of R&D spending as we have looked back over the last 50 years. You'd sort of expect big countries with big agricultural economies to spend more on ag research than smaller agricultural economies. So economists make up this thing called an intensity of investment. And what we're simply doing here is dividing the amount of R&D spending by the value of agricultural output that's serviced by that R&D spending. And so what this is showing you is, say, for example, in the US, we're spending about $2.60, $2.70 on public sector ag R&D for every $100 worth of agricultural GDP. All right, that's what that's saying. And we've had this, in a sense, knowledge deepening or research deepening of the US system over the past 50 or 60 years. So we're spending more on ag R&D relative to the size of the agricultural output than we were in yesteryear. Some of that might be because you have to run harder to stand still. Once you increase your productivity levels, it's a bit Alice in the Looking Glass, you need a lot of maintenance research. Hard to estimate, but I've seen estimates around that 40 to 70% of the dollars spent in the US are just to maintain yields with respect to biotic and abiotic stresses and things of that nature, not to increase yield levels and potentials and so forth. If you look at elsewhere in the world, so there's the high income in the US countries. US is similar. If you look in Asia Pacific, it might be a surprise to see that they've only been inching up their intensity of investment. So they've been running, and as I mentioned earlier, their ag economies have been growing really fast compared to ours. So although they've been ramping up their spending, they're only barely keeping up with the economic expansion of their agricultural economies. So they're just starting to move into this sort of knowledge R&D deepening in their sectors now. And I'd suspect going forward, they're going to start looking more like the high-income countries in the next 50 years. And in sub-Saharan Africa, despite comparatively healthy growth rates in their agricultural economies in the last few years, their intensities of investments have actually slipped. So they've become less research intensive over the last 50 years, not more. So that has big implications in terms of the nature and shape of productivity gains with respect to those countries. So I'm going to finish up with a set of slides which I'll step through, which is like a pseudo-dynamic view of the world in terms of what's going on with ag R&D spending. And I'll just set this one slide up and then I'll let the slides hopefully speak for themselves. So what I've got in this vertical axis is this research intensity measure, how much we're investing in R&D relative to the size of our agricultural economies. And what I've done, each one of these dots represents a country. There's about 130 countries up there. And I've arranged the countries in terms of their per capita incomes. This is in 1960, all right? So we've got low-income countries here with $150 to $200 per capita of output, and rich countries over here to the right. This is the world's average research intensity as of now, just over $1.50 of investment in R&D for every $100 worth of output. The size of the bubble indicates something quite interesting. That is the relative size of the agricultural economies. So back in 1960, the US accounted for 13% of the world's agricultural GDP. So it's got a pretty large bubble. China has a smaller bubble. Back then, it accounted for 4% of the world's agricultural GDP. India, its agricultural GDP was twice the size of China's back in 1960. And we've got South Africa sitting up there, and we've got Nigeria sitting in there, and we've got Brazil sitting in there. And so the colours indicate regions. The red is Asia Pacific, the yellow is Sub-Saharan Africa, the green is Latin America and the Caribbean, the purpley colour is the Middle East, North Africa, and the blue is the high-income countries, the rich countries. And what I'm going to do is show you how this plays out over time in terms of how countries are getting richer, they'll move to the right, and if they increase their intensity of investment, they'll move upwards over time. So just to get it on the right scale, this is the same graph, just recalibrated with a higher vertical scale here to allow for some intensity increase over time. And I'll step you through half a century of investments, global investments, and its consequences with respect to the size of the agricultural economy. So this is where we were back in 1960, 65, 70, 75. Huge change. This is then, this is now. And you'll see a lot of really interesting dynamics going on there. We haven't got enough time to go into them now, but you can see, for one, look at the relative sizes of the red bubbles versus the blue bubbles back then, and look at their relative size now. Agricultural value has shifted across the planet, more to the Asia-Pacific region than the rich countries. We think of agriculture as being this very pervasive sector in terms of its physical footprint on the landscape. If you look at it through an economic lens, it's a much more highly concentrated sector. 5 countries account for 52% of the entire world's value of agricultural production. 5 countries. In order now, they are China, the US, India, Brazil, and Indonesia. And so that's reflected in these bubbles. You can see these bubbles have shifted much more heavily towards the Asian part of the world. You can see that the rich countries, these blue countries up here, are intensively investing in agricultural R&D, but if you watch the slideshow, you can see the red countries have started on this trajectory now too. They're at the cusp of starting to intensify their investments in ag R&D. So if I was a betting man, one scenario is, if we don't get a policy change in the rich countries are going to follow this trajectory down here, that they'll get richer. All the projections are that they'll get richer, hopefully they will. But their intensity of investment relative to the size of their agricultural sectors is likely to start declining, could decline. The Indias and the Chinas and so forth are likely to get substantially richer, and all the projections I see not close entirely, but shrink the per capita income gap between today's middle income countries and today's high income countries. And if they can keep investing at more or less the rates that they're doing, and there seems to be a fairly sustained policy incentive to do that, they may well be the people who are investing more intensively than the rich countries. If someone's standing here 50 years from now and giving this talk. Of course, all these things are endogenous to policy choices. This is just if the sort of recent past carries forward to the future. These things can be changed, and so this is not a forecast by any means, it's a prediction based on a certain set of assumptions. So, unfortunately, as I mentioned earlier, these countries, the gold countries, sub-Saharan Africa, the yellow countries, haven't moved much in terms of average per capita income over half a century, and they certainly haven't moved much in terms of their intensity investments, and they sit well below the global average intensity of investment. So if we're looking for the prospects of productivity growth coming out of Africa, that's a dismal story. We've done a bunch of other work to show perhaps one of the options is to be much more creative about research spill-ins. Research done elsewhere in the world can certainly impact African agriculture, so there's lots of work going on drought tolerance and things of that nature. Nitrogen use efficiency and so forth. It could be very helpful for African agriculture if we can get those technologies into the hands of farmers. Big if. That's a story for another talk. So, to finish up, here's pulling together my threads of thought. So, I sense, as I look at the data, both here in the US and elsewhere in the world, that we're actually in an era of slower and perhaps even still slowing agricultural productivity growth. If you think about the lags involved in this R&D spending, that what we've been doing over the last few years in the rich countries is going to carry forward over the next decade or two, notwithstanding any policy changes we make now, which could turn those things around. But I think the inertia and momentum in those systems are such that we're likely to see some slower agricultural productivity growth over the years ahead. We see clearly in these data a retreat by the world's richest countries from their historical role as principal providers of the global public goods of agricultural science. So in the early days of the CG system, there was a huge presence of the US and the CGIR, both in human capital and investments and so forth. You don't see that as much these days. Still important, but not big. And we're seeing new institutional arrangements emerge between Brazil and China and sub-Saharan Africa and elsewhere. And so my sense is the ground's shifting in terms of the public goods component of agricultural science. It will take a while to play out, and the US system is still a biggie and will play a big role for decades to come. I'm talking about something that will take a while to play out, not going to happen tomorrow. An ever-increasing share of R&D in the rich countries is directed off farm issues. So we've had this creeping move towards more proprietary, i.e. privately performed research. They're related but different things. There's a lot of proprietary research done in public institutions as well. And a fair bit of that is off-farm, post-farm in particular. But even within the land grants and the USDAs, we've seen a shift in the orientation away from things that focused on farm productivity and addressing issues of environmental concerns, food safety concerns, all things where there's constituents and arguments and economic value to perhaps be had. But because we've had this expanding agenda in public agricultural research, at the same time we've had a slowing or a cutback in R&D spending, something has to give, and what's been giving is investments on maintaining or enhancing productivity growth. As best I can do, I trod through all the CRIS data, and my estimates are that we've gone from about 68, 69% of all of the land grant and USDA spending going on maintaining or enhancing productivity down to barely 54%. So barely half of what goes on in the experiment stations now has got anything to do with farm productivity. You saw on the data I just showed you this pretty stable relationship that as per capita incomes rise, and conversely, as the ag share of the economy falls, we tend to increase the intensity of investments in agricultural R&D. And crystal ball gazing is not my best forte, and the future is definitely uncertain, but I think in these data there is clear evidence of a shift and perhaps evidence of an emerging new world order with respect to ag R&D. Thank you very much. Yeah.
We have time for questions.
Does your information indicate that China, India are conducting their administrative decisions in a better way than the US and the other developed countries? Question number one. And question number two, will this situation actually lead to a kind of actual monopoly of China and India on know-how and patents and whichever in respect to ag technologies?
Are those two countries doing things better? Hard to get a yardstick on that. By better, are they making more, say, economically rational decisions on where and what they do their research on? I think it's really hard to call. They've certainly, at a macro policy level, they've made a really critical decision to sustain these investments in public goods ag R&D. This is on public sector ag R&D for decades. The rich countries haven't done that. So their macro policy decisions about how much to spend and the direction of spending relative to all the evidence I see about the returns to this R&D. I mean, a common question I get is, all the easy gains have been got. You know, but I spend a lifetime looking at and trying to put value on things you guys do, gals do for a living. I see no evidence done carefully that the returns to recent investments in R&D are any lower or higher than they were to investments done 50 or 80 years ago. Again, you've got to be careful of how you do that. People confuse the slowing down in yields as signs of, innovation in agriculture is slowing down. But as I said, just to sustain yields when you've got changing environmental and economic pressures on agriculture, to sustain past yields takes investment, and that has value. If you didn't do the R&D, that value would be lost. All right? So you have to count that value into the part of the returns to R&D. So I think, the policy decision to sustain the investments for the long run, that decision is being better done in other countries of the world rather than the US and even the Australias and so forth, which have started to falter in terms of their R&D spending. The monopoly question, I think that's a long way off. I do a lot of work on intellectual property rights, and I don't see evidence in the data of any sort of countrywide monopolisation of knowledge going on. Again, you don't want to think synonymously that public research is public good research, because increasingly in our situations, a lot of that's encumbered by intellectual property as well, so they're not synonymous. My estimates are that 85 to 90% of all of the world's private food and ag R&D still takes place in the rich countries. That's changing though, and that's hard to actually tease out. So you might have companies that are based here, but where in the world are they doing their research? As I look carefully at the data, that's shifting as well. All right, so you've got companies like Hormel, based in Minnesota, have opened up research facilities in Shanghai and so forth. So they're trying to target and get their research closer to, and I would expect a lot of food research is going to be increasingly done offshore by these companies to sort of tap into local demand, idiosyncratic sort of behaviour and so forth, and target those markets very carefully with the form and function of the foods they're delivering into those markets. It's very hard to do sitting in Minnesota to target Chinese palates, So my sense is there'll be a lot of offshoring of that private research over the next 20 to 30 years, more so in some areas than in other areas because of concerns of piracy, seed piracy and things like that might inhibit the movement out of Europe and the US of, say, the biological sciences into developing countries. So there's a complex set of factors in play there. It's not just a clear cut and dried sort of story.
So we'll take a quick question.
Okay. Kulwinder Gill, Washington State University. So what I'm trying to get a sense of is what $1 of R&D get you in different countries. The reason of the question is that we have talked India and China, and everyone there is aware of the growing population, 1 billion plus. So farmers and the policymakers, they're all very aware, and then intensive agriculture, unsustainable type of agriculture. So just a short question. So is there a good way to measure what $1 of each public dollar in R&D get you in terms of output that can be measured such that if that dollar was not spent, what would be the effect?
Yeah, there's it's a tough thing to do, but economists are used to making assumptions and diving into deep water. And so there's a lot of economic analysis exactly targeted to trying to think about what the economic returns are in terms of the benefits for every dollar that's spent. In fact, I and colleagues, we just posted it on the website of my centre. We just finished a compilation of all the rates of return studies that we could find globally. We have like 73 countries in the data set, 360 studies, and very healthy rates of returns. No sign that there's much systematic differences across geography in those returns. And as I said earlier, no signs that the returns now are demonstrably higher or lower than they were from research done in yesteryear. So yes, imprecise as they are, there are estimates around there trying to link the returns for a dollar to its impact on output and putting a value on that output.
And is there any trend globally?
Sorry, is there any what?
Is there any trend like richer country or poor country?
No, as I say, I don't see any change in the data across geography or across time in that data. It still is a really good way of spending public dollars, actually. It has, along with investments in education and probably aspects of infrastructure, it pays really handsomely high rates of returns.
Thank you.
Okay, well, this has been very thought-provoking. So let's thank Phil, and I will see you back here in about 20 minutes, I think. So. Be here during the break, so if you have other questions, please feel free.